This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern, and every week we'll be talking about books and ideas and other related stuff that caught our attention. Our guest today is a series editor at the SY Agnon Library at Toby Press in Jerusalem, as well as the founding director of Atid, an institute for Jewish education whose flagship project is webyeshiva.org, where he teaches courses of Agnon and others. He recently edited and published a new collection of stories. It's the 13th out of 15 planned volumes by the famed Israeli author. Some of these appear in English for the first time. This collection came out upon the 50th anniversary of Agnon's becoming the first ever Israeli, certainly the first ever Israeli writer, and only one to date to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1966. Rabbi Jeffrey Saks, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
So let's start with that momentous event, his winning the Nobel Prize. Do you think that the fact that Agnon is really the only Hebrew writer to win the Nobel Prize is a coincidence? Or are there certain qualities that make him stand apart from other Hebrew writers? And why him, an Israeli writer in a language hardly anyone speaks, as opposed to other international writers?
Well, there's so many questions inside your question in terms of why he was the only one and when will we see the next one. Each year there are always short lists of, which of our authors, are hopefuls. And there's no doubt that there are a whole variety of political concerns and machinations and other things that go into it. But let's set that aside for a moment. When Agnon won in 1966, he shared the prize with a German Jewish poetess named Nelly Saks, no relation to me. And the prize was very much viewed as an award to the Jewish people. 1966, it's not that long after the Holocaust. The state of Israel is only 18 years old. And it's a recognition that not only have the Jewish people survived Auschwitz, but they physically reconstituted themselves. But the mark of real revival is that we should be productive culturally. And if we're producing our own work, she was writing very lyrical Holocaust poetry, which frankly I have not made my way into because I don't think it's translated well. But Agnon was writing and had been writing. He was already much older than the average Nobel laureate. He was already nearing 80 when he won the prize, and he died just 3 years later. He had been writing since he was a teenager, and he's chronicling the Jewish experience in particularly Galicia, Eastern Europe, and here in Eretz Yisrael. Most of his stories here in Eretz Yisrael are in the land of Israel are set at the time of what's called the second Aliyah, the wave of Jewish immigration in the decade prior to World War I, precisely the time that he himself came as a young man. But they're all somehow speaking to larger questions of the Jewish people and the interaction between tradition and modernity and the transitions that the Jewish people were undergoing even before World War II.
Did he have an international standing before? Did it really propel him to the forefront?
Well, the prize certainly propelled him to the forefront, but he was recognized around the world. There was just a very lovely review of our series written by the literary critic Adam Kirsch in The New Yorker. And when it came out, I had opportunity to comment to David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, that the very, very first piece of literary criticism on Agnon written in English was written already, I think, in the early 50s by the most important literary critic of his age, Edmund Wilson, published in the New Yorker. And Agnon had been translated already from the 19-teens into German and then later into English and other European languages, including, of course, Swedish. Interestingly, we're translating a whole variety of stories into English, and the history of which stories were translated and not is bizarre. Some of the most important things have not yet been translated, and certain stories that, frankly, are quite marginal were translated decades ago. There's no rhyme or reason for why one thing was chosen for translation.
Is that true? There's no rhyme or reason? There's no sort of backstory behind any of them?
For certain things, the publishers thought, we should publish this novel. But Agnon wrote in a whole wide variety of genres, from teeny tiny short stories, almost little vignettes, to long multi-hundred-page novels. And there doesn't seem to have been a very specific idea for what should be translated and how and when. And for a long time, hopefully our series will correct this. For a long time, people that only read him in translation sometimes got a warped view because certain genres were overrepresented.
Which were those?
Translation. So he wrote a series of short stories called the Sefer HaMa'asim in Hebrew, the Book of Deeds. And these are these short, surrealistic, dreamlike, nightmarish tales, stories for which he was often compared to Franz Kafka, a comparison that he bristled at.
Although, as the Robert Alter piece says, he slyly said, well, my wife happens to own his entire collection.
Right. What he meant by denying that he'd read Kafka, which he later admitted was not technically true, he'd only read very little bit of Kafka, was that Kafka was not an influence on him. And a resemblance between two authors does not necessarily infer that one, the older, influenced the younger. Perhaps they were both descendants of an earlier ancestor. And already in many decades ago, it was pointed out that they were both, Kafka and Agnon, were both influenced by the surrealistic writings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, an influence that would have rendered Agnon's writings no less quote-unquote Kafkaesque. The fact that Kafka, we call that style after Kafka's name because he perfected it, doesn't mean that he invented it.
And he's certainly not the only writer, certainly in the mid-war period, to be writing with these kind of surrealistic notions. I'm thinking of Bruno Schultz in this sort of strange, dreamlike world.
But just to answer your question, those stories, because they were short and more modern, were translated. There was a volume called 21 Stories that was published around the time that he won the prize. When a foreign author wins the Nobel, the publishers in America rush to put something out in order to maximize sales. And that collection overrepresented those stories. So somebody that only knows Agnon from that collection, which for a long time was the only collection of short stories, would get a certain warped perspective. And our collection hopefully is coming to correct that.
Okay. I want to jump ahead because you mentioned something about how he writes so much about the old country, the Galician Jews, the town life, village life, and the moods and personalities of European Jewry. But then he also writes with equally penetrating kind of observations about this very, antiquated phase now of Israeli life, pre-Israel, of course. What do you think is the contrast between how he writes about the old country and how he writes about Israel, well, pre-Israel, Palestine at the time? Can you identify different literary styles or moods?
Yeah. There are certain themes that are common to both, and they both have to do with trying to hold up the Jewish people to a certain challenge of what does it mean to be going through a transition. And even stories, neo-Hasidic tales, things that look like they are addressing life before modernity in the early 19th century, if properly understood, and with Agnon you constantly have to read between the lines, it's really asking profound questions about the loss of tradition and the loss of faith as a kind of given constant of life. And what does it mean to live in the new reality? Because even if the stories are set pre-modernity, they're being written on this other side of whatever that historic breach in the Jewish condition has been. So that's going to be common in both stories. That doesn't mean the stories are always properly interpreted. They're stories. It happens to be it's still on the school curriculum. My children read it in elementary school. There's a short story about an etrog, the citron, for the Sukkot holiday. It's the story from which the filmmaker Shuli Rand based the film Ushpizin,
which is one of the most wonderful Israeli movies ever.
Now, it's not that film is not based on an Agnon story, but what Rand did was he took the seed out of that etrog, and from that seed, the film sprouted. But it's based on a kernel of an Agnon tale. That tale can be read and understood as a kind of pietistic, neo-Hasidic tale, completely misunderstanding the degree to which in Agnon's hand, it had undergone a transformation from its source material in Hasidic folk tales to a profoundly modern story. And the stories that are set in the land of Israel in the 20th century, so obviously we're more inclined to understand them as modern tales. But I think that's part of the point, that even the stories that are set in the quote-unquote old world really are modern if properly
because they're
understood.
struggling with this contradiction. As of course Agnon, who grew up religious, became less religious and then went back to religion.
Right.
So maybe it's also his own experiences with this struggle.
But I want to ask about the universal appeal of Agnon's stories that really propelled him to this international status and having him embraced by the Nobel Committee. You say in the introductory essay to the collection that the many layers that you just talked about in his writing, that you constantly have to read between the lines, is really the key to understanding his universal appeal. However, his work is so steeped in traditional content and religious references and very particular Jewish content. How is this great tension that is really omnipresent in his work can be reconciled?
Right, and to complicate the problem, his writing in Hebrew is a weaving together of the entirety of the traditional Jewish bookshelf.
I was going to add that question, but I didn't want to burden the question because you complained before that we had too many sub-questions. But we should talk about that separately. It's a whole other issue.
So the question really is, how can he? People ask me all the time, particularly Israelis, with the natural, understandable chauvinism that they demonstrate. How can Agnon be? You're translating Agnon. How can he be read?
That was going to be my next question.
How can he be read in translation? Which is no different than if you're walking in St. Petersburg. They can't imagine Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in a foreign language
But what those Israelis are not admitting is that, as Robert Alter points out also, they can barely understand Agnon, the younger generation, because our Hebrew today is so different from his
So the question
weaving
is
together.
not, can you read Agnon in English? The question is, can you read Agnon today in Hebrew? For some people, obviously, you can. This has nothing to do with a denominational question of Orthodox versus other denominations, but it does require, to fully understand, it does require a certain flexibility and comfort within the traditional bookshelf. But even if you strip it of all of that, and many of his readers, presumably those judges in Stockholm in 1966, were not studying the Talmud and the Midrash, but they understood that he was saying, it still works on the level of great literature. The human drama is still powerful. One of his great themes is frustrated love.
Who doesn't understand that?
Right. There's virtually no love story that ends they lived happily ever after. So to one degree, but those stories can all and have been interpreted as some kind of allegory, sometimes correctly interpreted, sometimes incorrectly interpreted, some kind of allegory for the frustrated love between God and the Jewish people, between the condition of the Jewish people in exile, banished from their home, not exactly divorced. If you pick up on the rabbinic allegory on the Song of Songs, the biblical Song of Songs, which on the simple reading is an erotic love story between two lovers who are somehow estranged, who somehow can't get it together. One lover's knocking at the door and the other one somehow can't get there to let him in on time. That's interpreted rabbinically as the condition of the Jewish people estranged from God, and that's what Agnon is writing about on one level. But at the same time, he's writing about the human drama of frustrated love, which is something that can be read in any language.
Okay, so if the reader can pick and choose the level that they want to engage in, this is a privilege that the translator doesn't have. I mean, I want to ask you really about the task of translating Agnon, because it is almost like translating poetry. There are really so many layers and complexities in the text. Can you give us a couple of examples about special challenges that stood out in the process?
Some of the translators, and Agnon has been translated into English already from the late 1920s. Some of the translators didn't do, frankly, such a good job. And if they did a good job 80 years ago, those translations need updating. I don't believe that you can translate Agnon literally. It just simply can't be done. But I'll give you an example from a book that we worked on recently. Agnon has a novel called, in English, it's called In Mr. Lublin's Store. It's the previous volume that came out and was translated very well by Professor Glenda Abramson. And I worked with her. In our edition, in all of our editions, we have annotations, not footnotes. Nobody wants to read a novel and bump up against reference numbers along the way. But for the reader that's curious in unearthing the source work or is somehow puzzled by something in the realia, remember these stories are set long ago, regardless of this would be useful even in the Hebrew editions. So we have annotations that flesh things out. There's a long passage which is explaining something about Maimonides. We can't take for granted that our readers know much, if anything, about Maimonides because a translator can't choose his audience. And we want the book – obviously, there are market forces at work. We want the book to be as widely disseminated and read as possible. But Agnon in the Hebrew – takes for granted – Agnon imagined that his readers were people who were Jewishly knowledgeable. Certainly he would be horrified at the thought that there are contemporary Israelis today who would not know that when he says, I was reading Maimonides, or as he says, the Rambam, that refers to Maimonides' legal work, the Mishnah Torah, his code, his great encyclopedia of Jewish law. And then he makes some reference to the mountains of commentary that had built up on Maimonides, and he mentions them in passing. And he says it might have been better had those mountains of commentary not been piled up because we want to know what the bottom line is. So in order to understand what he's talking about, you need to understand the whole history of the interpretation of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, his code of law.
I mean, you're saying this, and I'm thinking, what Israelis are you talking about who would even have a clue of this kind of thing? Are we living in a different society than Agnon imagined?
We are unfortunately living in a different society than the one Agnon was writing for.
What's the main way that you think we're different from Agnon's experience?
I'll give you an example. At the Agnon House in Jerusalem, where I also serve as the director of research, I give a whole variety of courses, some in Hebrew, some in English. There's a story that I was recently teaching which depicts a scene at a Malava Malka. Now, you know what a Malava Malka is, but let's assume that not all of our listeners do. Malava Malka, which literally means escorting the queen, is the nickname for the festive meal that's eaten following the Sabbath. As the Sabbath queen is leaving, we have a meal because we didn't eat enough on Shabbat itself, of course. So we have a little something to escort the queen out the door after Shabbat is over. And the colloquial name for this is Malava Malka. I was teaching a course. I was teaching this story in front of an American audience in Jerusalem. Now, the Americans in Jerusalem that frequent these courses are all people who are Jewishly engaged. I don't know whether they're Orthodox or conservative or anything. That's irrelevant. But these are people that have facility with Jewish tradition. Part of what I do when teaching Agnon in English is to try to bridge the gap, to try to show them what's lost in translation. but I could take it for granted that they all knew what this concept Malava Malka is. It was an Israeli student, a student in the Hebrew literature department at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who was sitting in on the lecture, who afterwards said to me, Hayam ma'od na'im, that was very nice. But can you tell me, please, what is Malava Malka? That it was the Israeli that was estranged from the Hebrew and the tradition, and this is in a country where the main radio program on Saturday night for many decades was called Malava Malka.
But it's another generation.
But it's a different generation. I think that's something that would, completely independent of the question of Agnon's own periods of being more religiously observant, less religiously observant, he would have been horrified at the idea that there are Israelis who are not familiar with the woof and warp and weave of our sources and our tradition, from which he felt, and here's, I think, coming back to your original question, that's how the prize was interpreted in 1966, that it was a prize for the Hebrew language, that the Hebrew language is being recognized, because remember, one of the achievements of Zionism, of the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, was the revival or the
modernization,
reawakening of the Hebrew language. Agnon, together with Bialik and so many other figures, was part of the language wars that went on here in the early decades of the 20th century. He was not such a fan of Eliezer ben Yehuda. They didn't like the idea that ben Yehuda was called the reviver of the language, because in order to revive a language, it has to first be dead. They did not accept the idea that the language was dead. Hebrew was always the language of scholarship and prayer and learned people and literature and other things, but it certainly underwent a reawakening.
And Agnon's Hebrew is, to my mind, at least as a modern Hebrew speaker, a lot more traditional than that of his contemporaries of Bialik and others.
I want to also point out, this is such an interesting point that I think it's worth spending more time on, that it's not just the terminology that he uses and the idiomatic expressions and references to all those, Jewish commentary, but it's way back to even the cadence of the Bible. I was looking at the translation that you did of the translation of To the Galilee, and I just want to quote it briefly because it's so interesting how it really recalls biblical stories. It says, and I quote, "I departed Jaffa and walked 9 hours to Hadera. Arriving at night, I found a place to sleep at a roadside inn leased by an Arab. I bathed my feet in hot water, rubbed them with olive oil, ate some of my bread and olives, spread myself out on the straw up in the loft, and slept soundly until morning." I went back to the beginning of the article to make sure I hadn't, chanced upon some text copied right from the Bible. It's the rhythm and it's the style of observation or something that sounds like a biblical parable.
A biblical parable. And Agnon, and these were part of the debates about what form modern Hebrew should take. And Agnon really did believe that it should have the cadence and the flavor of principally of rabbinic Hebrew, of Mishnaic Hebrew. And there are all types of differences for the contemporary Israeli reader. The contemporary Israeli reader can read Agnon. It's not like American readers or English readers reading Beowulf. It's just simply not true. There's no Israeli schoolchild who can't read Agnon and understand what he's saying. There's a word you don't understand here or there.
And syntax we don't use anymore. Really,
but we live in a world with dictionaries, and all of the children are carrying one around in their pocket on their phone. It's not hard to look up a word, but it's not true, this kind of bad rap that you can't read Agnon, you can't understand.
And while we're at To the Galilee, I'd like to ask you a bit about something that comes out of it, and that is that really the holiday of Lag BaOmer features prominently in it, and it's coming up in a couple of weeks. You say that it's a long obsession of Agnon, or as you call it, a self-made myth. What is the nature of that obsession Agnon has with Lag BaOmer?
One of Agnon's greatest literary creations was Agnon himself. Of course, Agnon was a pen name taken from Agunot, the first Hebrew story he publishes when he arrives in Jaffa in 1908.
And maybe tell our listeners what Agunot means.
Agunot quite literally means abandoned wives or chained wives. Today, colloquially, it's used to refer to women who are unable to obtain a religious divorce from their husbands. But historically, it meant a husband goes off on a voyage and never returns. And in the days before the GPS and the cell phone, we don't know what happened to him. So she's in a state of limbo, unable to, not divorced, not widowed, just literally chained to this missing husband. It's the exact opposite of how it's colloquially used today. Today, agunot, they want to be freed of their vile, rotten, miserable, scoundrel, deadbeat husbands. And it's just a way of figuring out the mechanisms to make that happen. But historically, the agunot were women. Every day they were praying that their husband, who maybe was lost at sea, will walk through the door, and they would sit at the window looking out. Maybe he's come into town right now. It's a completely different emotional experience, and that's the agunot that Agnon is talking about, and that is the metaphor that I spoke of earlier of the distance, the national distance between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, between the Jewish people and themselves, their tradition, the Jewish people and God. So Agnon takes on the name Agnon. His birth name was Chachkis, Shmuel Yosef Chachkis.
Which doesn't sound great in modern Yiddish.
It doesn't sound great. Chachkis, little toys,
little insignificant, cheap toys.
But everything about his biography was part of the myth. He claimed he was born on Tisha B'Av, 1888. Tisha B'Av, the day of historic mourning for the destruction of the two Jerusalem temples and a whole slew of other tragedies that befell the Jewish people. August 8th, 1888, the 8th of the 8th, 88. If you look on a calendar, which is easier to do today than it was then, because you can just Google right now, August 1888, you'll see that Tisha B'Av did not fall out on August 8th.
Oh, no.
In fact, he was born a year earlier in
I'm done with that.
In 1887, but also in the summer, not on Tisha B'Av itself, but this is part of the myth. He claimed that he arrived on Aliyah to the land of Israel, to Yafo, on Lag BaOmer. This also probably wasn't true. He was rounding off to choose a date of historic significance.
But why was he focused on Lag BaOmer?
So he claimed that all the great things that happened to him in his life happened on Lag, and some of them actually did. His wedding anniversary was Lag BaOmer. His very first publication, his first piece of published writing when he was a teenager, I think he was 15, was published on. It was a story or a short poem for Lag BaOmer that was published for Lag BaOmer. In the story, which has To the Galilee, which you mentioned, which has an autobiographical element, like much of his writings have some kind of autobiographical element to them, although they should not be understood as autobiography. He makes a trip up to the Galilee to celebrate Lag BaOmer in Miron, the site of the great pilgrimage for Lag BaOmer, near Tzfat. And in those early years, 1910, I believe, there were these old stone buildings, abandoned buildings, and people went up to the roof of these buildings in order to see the bonfires that are lit.
Which is traditional on Lag BaOmer for our listeners who don't know.
Right.
That's
lighting of bonfires at the tomb of the Talmudic sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And one of these buildings collapsed, and quite a number of people were killed and injured, and he wasn't. He was spared. They thought this miracle that he was spared on Lag BaOmer. All of these things happened on Lag BaOmer. But Lag BaOmer is a date which sits at this intersection of mysticism and folklore and tradition, and it becomes a holiday, although it was celebrated and marked for many centuries in the diaspora, becomes a holiday which is very much associated with the return to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel, and in his generation of the people that had come to Palestine in that decade, these were all very pregnant things. And for some reason, it's a topic that he keeps coming back to again and again and again as he's recycling and retelling. Like he did with the Hasidic tale, he's recycling and retelling and modernizing the folk tales of the land of Israel, and this is going to be very central in his thought for Lag BaOmer.
I want to talk about another, maybe sometimes overlooked point about Agnon's writing, but I always find it prominent: his wit and his humor. It's hard for me to describe it because I read him both in Hebrew and in English, but you could probably do a better job.
Right. So he was very witty. He wrote in a variety of humorous style, and even in his really most tragic works, and his greatest works really are tragedies. I mean, tragedies on par with the Greeks, but there's always some kind of comic relief. There's always, and he knew the importance of releasing the steam in order to keep the story going. And sometimes the comedy comes through wordplay, which is a great challenge for us as translators to capture. And sometimes it just comes through pointing up the foibles of people. Whenever he wants to satirize Jews, he shows them sitting at the table tucking in for a meal, because Jews and food is always going to be a subject for humor. He does also have a whole subgenre. It's not a great theme, but a subgenre of political satires. We collected them together. They don't appear in one specific book in Hebrew, but in our series we collected them together in a volume called The Orange Peel and Other Stories. And those are his political satires, where he's really skewering the Jew, particularly questioning what does it mean for the Jewish people to return, to be sovereign, and to be in charge of our own affairs, and our proclivity to sometimes be our own worst enemies. And that's something that he was able to skewer quite efficiently.
All right, I'm afraid this is all we have time for.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, in the words of Basil Fawlty, as I say regularly, I could spend the rest of my life having this conversation, but I'm afraid we cannot.
And there is a lifetime, of course, of SY Agnon work to be read.
Of course, to be read.
And yet still to be translated.
Including the 15 volumes that comprise your series that you edit, Rabbi Jeffrey Saks, at the SY Agnon Library at Toby Press. You're also the founding director of Atid, an institute for Jewish education, whose flagship project is called webyeshiva.org, where you teach courses on Agnon and others. Thank you very much for coming in today and discussing the impressive work of SY Agnon.
It's a momentous challenge, really. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And any conversation that would bring together Basil Fawlty and SY Agnon is worth having.
Also, a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick, or we recommend listening to every single one of them. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.